When I was in college, my dad wrote me just 2 letters. He'll talk your ear off, but he's not much of a letter writer, my dad. And he usually only wrote to one of us when he had something he really needed to share or really needed to process. He worked as a superintendent in a regional claims office of a large national insurance company, and most of his time was spent dealing with people who tried to defraud the insurance company by claiming that their stuff had been stolen or burning down their garages or pretending they had been more seriously injured in an accident than they had been, like the woman who claimed to be unable to move her neck until my dad drove by her house and saw her out hanging laundry on the line and honked, and as he went by, she went like this. My dad was a busy guy. And in one of his letters, he was frustrated by all the people that had tried to defraud the insurance company, and he imagined what he might do to make the world a better place if he himself became king of the world. So imagine just for a moment that you become king or queen of the world. Imagine what you might do with that kind of power. And I want you to think old school, none of this accountability to Parliament or Congress or elected bodies, just the old-fashioned fairy tale kind of king or queen who can do whatever you darn well please. Imagine what you might do with that kind of power. And now imagine this. Jesus, knowing that God had given all things into his hands, takes off his outer robe, ties a towel around himself, and begins to wash the disciples' feet. At this point, Jesus knows his hour has come. He knows he doesn't have much time left in this fleshly form, and he gets down on his knees and washes feet. It's a common misunderstanding that hosts in this time period would wash the feet of their guests. They did not. In truth, it was rare for them even to provide a servant to do such a thing. Usually the most a host would offer might be a basin of water and a cloth so you could wash your own feet. But Jesus, knowing that God had given all things into his hands, takes off his robe, ties a towel around his waist, and begins to wash the disciples' feet. It sounds like a tender scene, but pay attention to the way John writes this. In fact, always pay attention to the way John writes anything. In this case, he creates a scene that is dark and ominous at the edges. I wonder if you noticed. Jesus knows that his time has come. And so we can imagine that twist in the pit of his stomach as he imagines what is in store in the next hours. Jesus also knows that Judas is going to betray him. Judas, whose feet he will wash. Judas, into whose hands he will place bread dipped in oil. Judas is darkly present in this scene, as is Satan, with whom Judas is complicit. And when darkness and evil loom over a space, it creates a sense of urgency, maybe even desperation, and everyone in the room can feel it. John lays it out this way so that we feel the deep contrast between the evil of Judas and the self-sacrificing love of Jesus, and we get suspended in that tension. And that tension only mounts as Jesus does something incredibly contrary to their male-centric culture. In spite of all they have seen, what Jesus does is still beyond their ability to comprehend and way outside the proper order of things. He takes off his robe, ties a towel around himself, and begins to wash their feet. John sets up this powerful tension between darkness and light, good and evil, and he increases the contrast by painting a picture of love that transcends anyone's understanding. all the power in the world in his hands, loving the disciples to the end that is looming, we find Jesus on his knees with his hands in the basin, using a towel tied around his own body to take onto himself all of the dirt and grime they have dragged in on their dusty, tired feet. Love and power shining in the darkness of evil, all tangled up in towels and dust and feet. It helps to back up just a little. John writes, Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, loved him to the end. And that's John's way of inviting you to think, how did he love his own who were in the world? Jesus loved them first by becoming the Word made flesh, abiding with them in all that it is to be human, from the very first shock and pain of being born of a woman. Then Jesus finds them, seeks them out, and bids them come and see. He shows them wonders, the power of God in his hands to bless the most ordinary things like weddings and picnics. He patiently teaches them a new way of seeing as he opens the eyes of the blind. He tends to their hunger, their pain, their paralysis. Jesus includes and liberates women. Jesus defeats death. He loves his own by helping them imagine a world that is beyond the limits of this one, a world shaped by greed and politics and religious strictures and the limitations of broken human bodies. Jesus loves them and loves them and loves them until it is finished. With all the power of God in his hands, the darkness and evil looming in the corners of the room, the clock ticking down, he takes off his robe, ties a towel around himself, and washes their feet. And it's all too much for Peter. And I am with Peter. I imagine sitting there as Jesus, stripped of his garments, comes and kneels before me and tries to take my unpedicured feet into his hands. And I'm not kidding. They're unpedicured. You know this feeling. You know who you are. And yes, I am pointing my finger at you because you know who you are. You have trouble asking for help. You have trouble accepting offered help. You struggle to expose your need for companionship, for support, for kindness, for friendship, or just for a pair of strong hands to help you. We lived through some dark days several years ago when one of our children was really struggling. We had gotten a call that they needed to go to the emergency room. And I found out just as two young families were walking into my church office for a baptism class, and I mean literally coming in the door while I'm on the phone with Ted. And Ted says, "You stay, you do what you have to do, I've got this. And then you can pick up Sam from karate." So Ted went to the ER with our child, and I muscled our way through the baptism class, wanting to tell these families to put those bright, shiny babies down and just run as far as they could go. Because I was remembering my own little one when they were bright and shiny and were now in such pain. And when the class was over, I called a friend just to let her know where Ted was with our child, and my friend Kim said to me, "I'll get Sam. You go home and wait there for Ted to call you." And of course I responded, as every one of you would, No, it's okay. I've got this. You have your own kids to take care of tonight. I'm fine." And I will never forget the way she said back to me, "Chris, go home. I am going to get Sam from karate. And Chris, I want you to cry. Do you hear me? Cry." And so I thanked her for getting Sam, and I hung up. Other people were coming into the building for other meetings, so I slipped out a side door, got in my car, and headed for home. And I had no plans to cry. I was just going to go home and wait patiently there for Kim to return with Sam and for Ted to call from the hospital. And as I was driving home, I suddenly could hear Peter, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus' response, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Do you know this experience I'm talking about? Where you have it all under control? Where you can handle it? You don't want to be a burden. Stiff upper lip, firm chin, deep breaths, busy, 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 busy. And there's Jesus, who has loved you from the beginning, who loves you to the end, kneeling at your feet saying, "Put your tired, aching feet in my hands. Let me love you. Let me take your burdens, your shame, your sin, your worry, your helplessness, your sorrow, your fear, your grief." Jesus might sound stern. "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." But Jesus has shown us what love demands. Feelings, sure. Action, definitely. But also the deep vulnerability of receiving. Receiving is an opening of ourselves, exposing our own heart and acknowledging His. To be loved, to be truly loved, is not something to which we can just intellectually assent. It is something we risk. It's something we must dare. We are a people who admire power and intellect and authority, and we have been raised on the God of the omnis, omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. And yet God takes all that power, all that presence, all that wisdom, all of it, and places it in the hands of the Word made flesh. And with those hands, tenderly takes your feet and loves you. Jesus loves you until the end and beyond. Amen.